Darius Johnson never expected a simple hat to ignite a storm that would shake the foundations of his world. A red MAGA cap, worn as a symbol of personal choice, became the spark that lit a fuse of explosive prejudice in his small-town high school. His teacher's harsh words weren't just an attack on his beliefs. They were a brutal reminder that in the eyes of many, his worth was already determined by the color of his skin. But what happened next, when the truth about Darius's family came to light, would send shockwaves through the entire town. You won't believe how the story unfolds from here. Let's start from the beginning. 15-year-old Darius Johnson was a student at a small-town high school in the South, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. His father, Michael Johnson, was the mayor of the city, a powerful political figure whose influence stretched far beyond the town limits. But few of Darius's classmates knew about his father's position. To them, Darius was just another black teenager, navigating life in a world that often assumed he was no different from the other kids in his community, that his worth and potential were defined by the color of his skin. Despite his father's political success, Darius had always felt the sting of prejudice at school. His teachers often made assumptions about his abilities, seeing his race as a predictor of his success or failure, rather than recognizing him as an individual. It was a subtle but constant weight, one that Darius carried with him through each class, each hallway. On this particular morning, Darius had decided to wear a bright red MAGA hat, the kind that had become a polarizing symbol of political division in the country. To him, the hat wasn't about politics. It was a form of self-expression. He wore it because it was different, because it was bold. He didn't expect the attention it would draw, but when he stepped into Mr. Smith's classroom, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Mr. Smith, known for his strict demeanor and conservative views, wasted no time in calling Darius out. "You think it's appropriate to wear that hat in my classroom?" Mr. Smith's voice rang out, causing the rest of the class to fall into an uncomfortable silence. Darius's stomach tightened, already knowing where this was headed. Before he could respond, Mr. Smith's tone grew harsher. "You should know better than to support something that divides this country, especially given your background." The words hit Darius like a slap in the face. It wasn't just about the hat. It was about the assumption that, because he was black, he was somehow ignorant, that his thoughts and actions were defined by the stereotypes others had of him. Mr. Smith's words stung, not only because of the prejudice they carried, but because they echoed the way the world so often saw Darius, as a product of his environment, not as someone capable of independent thought. Darius tried to stay calm. "It's just a hat, Mr. Smith," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The teacher scoffed. "It's not just a hat, Darius. It's a symbol of everything that's wrong with this country. You're too young to understand the weight of what you're supporting." The other students, who had been quietly watching the exchange, began to murmur. Darius could feel their eyes on him, their judgment, as if they were waiting for him to crack under the pressure. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he stood his ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Smith, I understand perfectly," Darius said, his voice growing firm. "This is my choice. I'm entitled to wear whatever I want." Mr. Smith's face twisted into a sneer. "You're entitled to make your own choices, but when you wear something that promotes hate, you make a choice that's harmful to everyone around you." Darius's frustration grew. He had dealt with these kinds of comments his whole life. People assumed his worth based on their stereotypes, their views on what it meant to be black and political in America. They didn't see him as an individual, only as part of a group they thought they understood. As Mr. Smith's tirade continued, the classroom felt smaller. the walls closing in. The tension in the air was palpable. Darius's thoughts raced. He wanted to lash out, but he knew better. He had learned from his father that calm, controlled responses often had the most power. But he also knew he couldn't let this go without saying something. "You know," Darius said, finally breaking through the growing silence, "not everyone agrees with your point of view. Maybe you should listen to people before judging them." Mr. Smith's face reddened, and he pointed at the door. "You can take that nonsense outside if you're going to disrespect my classroom like that." It was a humiliating moment. Darius knew it wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about the way Mr. Smith had decided to treat him, based on assumptions, based on a prejudice that had nothing to do with who he was or what he believed. But there was something more. Darius knew he wasn't just any student. His father was the mayor, and soon Mr. Smith would learn just how big of a mistake he had made. The next day, Darius came home from school, seething. He told his father what had happened, explaining the entire confrontation with Mr. Smith. Michael Johnson listened intently, his face stern but calm. "You did the right thing by standing up for yourself," Michael said after a long pause. "But what he did to you, that's not just ignorance, that's prejudice. He made a decision based on a stereotype, and it hurt you." Darius nodded, though he wasn't sure if his father understood the full extent of his anger. "I don't care about the hat, but the way he treated me, like I was some kind of example." Michael stood up and walked to the window, deep in thought. After a few moments, he turned back to his son. "This isn't just about you. This is about the way people like Mr. Smith view people like us. And sometimes, you have to remind them of their place." Darius was silent. He knew what his father meant. It wasn't just about correcting Mr. Smith. It was about correcting the system that allowed teachers like him to hold such power over students without consequence. Later that evening, Michael Johnson called a meeting with the school's principal. He made it clear that he would not tolerate this kind of treatment of his son, especially not from someone in a position of authority. The following week, Mr. Smith was called into the principal's office for a meeting with the mayor. Word had spread quickly through the town, and soon the local news had caught wind of the story. The public reaction was swift. Many people expressed outrage at the teacher's treatment of Darius, especially once they learned who his father was. The story spread across social media, and people rallied behind Darius, condemning the teacher's actions. At the school board meeting, Mr. Smith was forced to apologize publicly, not just to Darius, but to the entire school. His apology seemed insincere, but it was enough to quiet the growing backlash. But for Darius, the real victory came when he saw the shift in his peers. The students who had once been silent now openly supported him. And even Mr. Smith, for all his pride, seemed to realize that his actions had consequences beyond the classroom. In the end, Darius didn't just win a battle for himself. He forced the community to reckon with its own biases, and in doing so, he found his own strength in the face of injustice. And while Mr. Smith may not have understood the full weight of what he had done, Darius walked away, knowing he had made a statement. No one was going to define him based on their assumptions.